Welcome back to the ETSI IQC Quantum Safe Cryptography Virtual Executive Conference. It's time now for our panel discussion on quantum readiness and the resilience of the digital economy. There are countless potential threats to our organization, society and economy. And of course, being proactive is better than being reactive, but we just don't have the resources or mind space to address them all proactively. So how do we prioritize? And why would the quantum threat be one of the higher priority threats to manage? To address this issue, please welcome back Professor Michele Mosca, who is co-founder of the Institute for Quantum Computing at the University of Waterloo, Steve Grobeman, Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at McAfee, and Professor Sir Peter Knight, Senior Research Investigator at Imperial College and Chair of the UK National Quantum Technology Programme Strategy Advisory Board. Welcome everyone. Let's firstly address the main subject of the panel. We don't have the ability to proactively address all these potential threats that we face, so how do we prioritize them? Michele, let me ask you that one first.
In a sense, that's not a new problem. I think maybe the new nuance we need to get better at is distinguishing between short-term costs and benefits and medium to long-term costs and benefits. Because in a given time scale, I think there's reasonable practices and ways of costing things and prioritizing, depending on likelihood and impact and so on. But I think where we need to get better is the more systemic looming threats that will have immense positive or negative consequences, but nothing really short term. So we need to get better at internalizing those costs. So we're also doing the prioritization correctly for the medium and longer term threats.
Great. And Steve, how do you see these threats and our prioritization of them?
Yeah, I think there's really two key points I'd like to make is we can't only think about the threats that are going to impact us today, but the things that we're doing today that will have impacts tomorrow. So the challenge with quantum cryptanalysis is even if it becomes practical in 3 to 5 years, data that is stolen today that's encrypted with quantum unsafe algorithms is vulnerable to attack. And I think building off the previous point, it's really about also understanding these lower probability catastrophic impact events that we have to get ready for. I think if you take our existing health pandemic that we're working through right now globally, global pandemics only occur, every many years, once a century, but the impact is so severe that we can't ignore them. Similarly with a threat like quantum cryptanalysis, when somebody cracks RSA and can read every data stream that they're able to capture on an untrusted network like the internet, that's a big deal.
And so, Peter, we can't afford to ignore the quantum threat.
No, that's exactly right. But let me just reinforce what we just heard. There are things we have to do fairly straightforwardly now in terms of the cybersecurity elements of things, and they're underway. They're the everyday things that we know that we have to deal with in terms of the classical threats. But there is this much longer term threat which really undermines all of our cryptographic primitives, and that requires a much longer term analysis. It needs testing, evaluation, and so on, which is not trivial. It cannot be done immediately, but that threat is imminent.
Michele, how might it impact the quantum computing sector if major advances towards cryptographically relevant quantum computation are made, but there still isn't sufficient confidence in the resilience of digital systems to quantum attacks?
Yeah, I think it'd be, a disaster really for the quantum computing industry if we drop the ball and can't assure people that this wonderful new technology isn't going to hurt them more than it's going to help them. And it's a completely avoidable disaster. I'm hopeful, but there's a lot of work to be done that we can avert that disaster. But if we don't have confidence that our cyber systems, our digital systems will be resilient against these new technologies, there's going to be an intense push to sort of shut them down or heavily guard them, and that will greatly limit organizations' ability to benefit from, to profit from this wonderful new technology.
Yeah, I just building off of that, one of the things that I think we need to think about with technology in general is technology doesn't have a moral compass. When we invented aviation in the beginning of the 20th century, it helped people travel around the globe much faster. It also made the effectiveness of war more lethal. I think quantum computing is in exactly the same boat. While it has tremendous promise for solving all sorts of scientific challenges that will benefit humanity, it'll also be used by a wide array of actors to break our security measures that we're relying on today. And simply recognizing that technology will be used for both good and bad is critical to attacking the problem. And as was just mentioned by the previous comment, like, this is a solvable problem. We know that we have the ability to build quantum resistant algorithms. The only thing stopping us from doing it is the will to do it.
Yeah, if I could just add to all of that, one of the things that worries me really is that there needs to be a persuasion that the benefits of quantum computing in a wide range of applications that benefit society really outweigh the threat. If we overplay the threat space and clamp down on the civil applications, of course it will go dark. The threat will still be there, but we won't enjoy the benefits that this wonderful new technology really offers to everybody. So I think there's a great deal to be done here in terms of working with the community, working with the regulators to make sure we understand exactly where we're going so that we don't just end up with a dark threat space. We need to have the economic benefits of this new sort of IT.
Well, let's look towards what corporations can do. What could a board of directors, Steve, what could a board of directors be doing now to make sure their companies that they oversee are well positioned to both reap advantage of quantum technology and also manage this intrinsic risk?
So I think there's a few things. Number one, for technology or companies in technology sectors that could benefit from quantum computing, starting to understand that now is key. From the cybersecurity side, specifically the risks associated with quantum being able to break our public key algorithms and making it such that data is exposed to adversaries, what companies need to do is first triage their data systems. So look at what is the timeliness of how long data needs to be secured. Systems that are housing that data, whether it's intellectual property, in the case of government, national secrets, those are systems that need to be prepared for rapid retooling when quantum safe algorithms become available. Finally, moving to modern algorithms and protocols that we have available today can make the impact of quantum cryptanalysis less scalable for adversaries. So things as simple as moving to TLS 1.3 for a company's cloud and web services are things that will make it more difficult for an adversary to execute a quantum attack at scale.
So Peter,
I wonder if we could come back to the key part of this, which was what could a board of directors be doing? And one of the things that I certainly recommended when I chaired a UK government review of cybersecurity research is to recommend that in order to get a board of directors alert to this, it isn't just adequate to say this is the responsibility of the IT manager or the security manager. It has to be responsibility of the board. And in particular, the audit committee of companies need to have this on their risk register so that they report back to the main board, so that we could really make sure that the board is truly accountable and haven't just shrugged this off to the technical side of the company. It has to be right at the heart of the company, and I think audit and risk subcommittees of the main board have to have the quantum threat on their radar in their risk register.
And Michele, if you're in the boardroom there, what would your recommendation be?
I mean, I totally agree with what's just been said, because if the boards do this, and that will create a pull for a quantum impact assessments, quantum readiness planning, and a quantum risk management plan. And these things will more naturally fall into place.
So it's apparent that, as has been said, this isn't something that can be pushed away to IT departments. This really has to be at the top of organizations' thinking.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it really is important that there's a strong broad executive support, because no one department can really develop and implement a quantum readiness plan and a quantum risk management plan. And when we go and sometimes go do work with companies, we might get buy-in within one department, but to really do a full quantum risk assessment, we need cooperation and input from other departments. And they're not hostile, but sometimes it's really hard to get their attention because they're busy with so many other things. But if it's a board level requirement, if it's an audit committee requirement that this be done, then you'll get that broader support across the various units of an organization, and you'll be able to get the job done.
Yeah, the one thing I would just add on to that is I think risk committees in general need to take a harder look at low probability, high impact risk across the board.
Exactly.
And, we can argue about whether quantum cryptanalysis will be practical in 3, 5, 10, 15 years. I would actually argue it doesn't matter, because what we all do agree on is there is a very high likelihood that it's plausible that the algorithms we depend on today will be broken, and therefore recognizing that high impact, low probability events can and do occur, and they need to be looked at across the board.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Peter, you're nodding there, and after all, we are talking about the resilience of the digital economy, and the digital economy is going to play an increasingly important part in society.
That's absolutely right. And within what we're trying to do within the UK program, our strapline on this one is to prepare for a quantum ready economy. Not just investing in quantum, of course, but ensuring that our normal economy is quantum ready. And that's become very much the governing principle by which we're influencing government departments here in the UK.
Well, regulation is a key part of the economy. Michele, how and where do you see the various regulators entering the scene here to make sure that cyber systems are quantum ready? And what would be helpful, and what would you say are the pitfalls that they need to avoid?
So, I mean, inevitably, regulation is an important part of any sort of safety or security matter. That's why how we manage safety on the roads and so on. But of course, there's countless different flavors of regulation. And so things that would not be helpful are, regulations that are too early and too prescriptive, right? And maybe only achieve the objective of absolving organizations from responsibility, because we did what the regulation said, therefore we're fine, even if we're not actually secure. So those are the kind of pitfall. That's an example of a pitfall to avoid, as well as being overly prescriptive. I think that really the net aim is to make sure there's an accountability and a responsibility, and these problems are properly managed. So when we say regulation, it's a bad word in many scenarios and in certain parts of the world, but obviously we do need some sort of smart regulation. But there's a lot of the light touch regulations as well that I think can really start to move things, such as requiring a quantum readiness plan or a quantum risk management plan or a quantum roadmap from certain vendors. Or there's lighter touch, and maybe it's not regulation per se, but vendor managers and so on should have certain language in their RFPs to ask about quantum readiness, right? And over time, if you're in charge of massive procurement for the government or an organization, you need to start asking those questions of your vendors, just like the NSA did 5 years ago in terms of its Suite B protocols. It alerted people that, look, we're going to be transitioning to quantum safe algorithms in the near future. And I think procurement departments and regulators around the world can start, if they haven't already, taking those first few steps of, initially they're sort of optional questions. You can say, no, I don't, but eventually you can't. You have to have a plan, and eventually you have to have implemented the plan. These are examples of where I think regulation can help create real accountability. Regulation is a way of internalizing these real costs that are down the road, the ones that Steve has alluded to, where it's very easy to ignore. But regulation is one mechanism for internalizing them. We just have to do regulations properly, so they're properly costed and accounted for.
So Peter, regulation is incredibly difficult to get right if you want to please all the people all the time. But any thoughts or any advice for how we maybe should tackle this for this field?
Well, inappropriate regulation could really be a kind of break on the need to actually move at speed in what's really a challenging area. So I think inappropriate regulation could be really, really dreadful. So there needs to be a wide dialogue on what is appropriate. But coupled to regulation should be the agreement on standards. And standards are really quite straightforward to deal with in terms of working worldwide on how we ensure the next generation of cryptographic primitives are all accepted, implemented appropriately. And that standards activity, I think, really needs a little bit more attention than it's currently getting in the quantum world.
Well, should we pick up on that? I think it's a good point. Steve and Michele, have you any thoughts about where we are with standards and the work we still need to do here?
Yeah, so I think, first off, we're making progress, but we're not moving as fast as we need to. NIST, in their selection, is moved from 69 algorithms that were initially submitted by research organizations around the world a few years ago, now down to a field of 15. It's great, we're making progress, but we're still, a year or years away from being able to take those algorithms and move them into product. I think one of the points that was just made is incredibly important, which is we do need standards because these algorithms are the underlying foundation for how systems talk to each other in a global world. And if we end up in a situation where the Western world has one set of standards, China ends up coming up with their own standard, own set of algorithms, other countries deciding to do their own thing, it's going to take a big step back from what we've achieved in reaching global economies, global communication. So we really do need to anchor on a common set of foundational building blocks that can be evaluated completely transparently. All users, organizations, and governments around the world need to have confidence that the next generation of standards are going to be safe from both quantum attack, but also traditional attack. And if we have those, it'll enable forward progress on all of the other digital capabilities that are innovating at light speed right now.
Yeah, I agree with these points. I think we do need to see cryptography, like robust, transparent, trustworthy, interoperable cryptography as a common good for all of society, for the global economy. This is not where we compete. It's not at the standards level. That's just a foundation upon which we can then build technology, create value, and so on. But we definitely want a very, again, transparently and trustworthy deployed new set of standards underpinning all of our digital technologies, of our digital systems. And a lot of credit is owed to standards bodies like ETSI and NIST, who have been taking a leadership role, and others as well, ISO and ITU. So there's a lot of standards have been started. There's many groups already working. There's more forming, but there's much more to be done. because these are just the base level standards. Then there's targeted standards like for financial industry, and they build and refer to things like the NIST standards. And we don't have time to do these things sequentially. We can't just sit back, relax, wait for the NIST standards in 2023, 24, and then start studying, okay, now how is this going to impact these higher level standards? We need to be working in parallel. There's a short list, so there's enough to be studied. You can already start testing and prototyping. In fact, even give feedback back to NIST and say, you know what? For these financial systems to really work properly, we need an algorithm with this property, right? And that's very helpful feedback for NIST as well as the other standards bodies. So there's a lot to be done. So we definitely have to give credit for the great work that has been done already and continues to be done. But there is certainly much more to be done, and we can't wait to do it sequentially. We have to be able to hit the ground running as the NIST standards come out, as more quantum cryptography standards come out, because then these are integrated in other systems with their own sets of standards. We also have to think about validation and certification, which is another matter that we already have to start thinking about. And techniques like hybrid key agreement, these are very important methods that can help us mitigate a lot of the issues of transitioning from old standards to new standards as well. And we do need to continue looking at these sorts of methods.
A related question then, Steve, what can researchers do to best support the migration to quantum safe cryptography? Are there any important gaps in our understanding, in our research areas that need to be filled?
In this area, I actually think we understand the fundamentals fairly well. While practical quantum cryptanalysis is still, at least publicly understood, to be a few years away, we do understand the algorithms and techniques that would be used and what it would take to build quantum safe algorithms. So for example, there's a fairly famous algorithm now called Shor's algorithm that is the algorithm a quantum computer would be able to use in order to execute an attack on a public key system like RSA or elliptic curve. So we actually have a pretty good foundational understanding of this. I think what's needed more is building off of the previous point, looking at the practical investments that are going to follow the new mathematical standards. So I have a lot of confidence that we will come up with new algorithms, but then those algorithms need to be worked into protocols. So how will the next version of TLS incorporate post-quantum? New ecosystems. So how do we do code signing so that all of our source code and binaries around the world have trust based on these new paradigms? And maybe the final point I'll make is pragmatism and practicality needs to trump everything else. And a good example of where we didn't do a great job with that is IPv6. So we built the IPv6 standard 20 years ago, and it's still minimally deployed, partially because we didn't focus enough on how practical it would be to do the deployment, to do the integration, all the work that would need to be done at every step of the way. And it's imperative that we don't make that same mistake again.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that systems integration of all of this really has to be accelerated in terms of where effort is being deployed. In terms of the research community, one area that I would like to see expanded is a bit more on pen testing, of penetration analysis, of looking at vulnerabilities within deployed systems. Because I think if we were to have red teams and blue teams actually examining some of these things, we would have a bit more confidence about how we then systems engineer this into real world applications.
Yeah, I agree. One really critical role for the research community is to continually test the robustness, the resilience of these alleged, what we hope are quantum safe algorithms. And it starts at the bottom. And Steve's correct. We understand the resilience of the proposed algorithms against the known quantum attacks. And where we really need researchers to work hard on is what about new quantum attacks that could be deployed, discovered in the next 10 years? There'll be, I think, a new era of quantum cryptanalysis as we actually have large-scale quantum computers on which to test our quantum attacks. So we need researchers to be vigilant about that and make sure that the algorithms, the cryptographic algorithms we've deployed, are resilient against these emerging new quantum methods, right? And that's why we need agility and the ability to increase key lengths or potentially change algorithms very quickly in case there is an unexpected advance in quantum algorithmics. And then we need researchers to look higher up the stack, as Sir Peters mentioned, in terms of the more implementation challenges, right? Hacking the implementations or hacking the protocols, hacking how the crypto's used. We need that as well. And another important role for the global research community is to participate in these global standardization efforts and make sure that what we do standardize and deploy is sound and is really serving the best interests of the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. We're going to pause our discussion here because we now want to hear from our audience. For now, everyone, thank you very much indeed, and we'll speak to you again soon. Throughout the day, we've been asking you to send in your questions for our expert guests. If you haven't already done so, then now is the time. In a few moments, we'll be back with our live Q&A session, and we'll resume our discussion on quantum readiness and the resilience of the digital economy. So please use the form here on the website, send us your questions, and we'll promise to get through as many of them as we can. We'll be right back after this short break.